Angus Goodbody, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
Thanks. So the NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, issues spring forecasts for Western rivers, including the Rio Grande. How does the Rio Grande look this spring?
Uh, this spring, we're looking at below median stream flow for most of the watersheds in the Rio Grande. It depends a bit on which part we're talking about. As a whole, the main stem down in central Mexico is expected to have a little less than 70% of median. Um, and that would be for the April through July runoff period. But there is quite a bit of variability. The good news is that the headwaters in Colorado probably are in the best shape right now. So still not at median or typical values, but not so far below.
So when you're compiling these forecasts, what are the different factors you consider?
So our forecast modeling system it's a statistical method that we use. We also work in conjunction with NOAA National Weather Service, and they use a process simulation model. So we actually have a few different sources of information um, available to us. I'll talk about the NRCS modeling system, though. Again, we really rely mostly on historical and current observations of snowpack and precipitation. And we collect most of those data through the SNOTEL network, which is our high elevation mountain ground-based observing system.
And so can you talk about how snowpack relates to streamflow and also how that has kind of changed?
Sure. So, in a lot of the Western U.S., we depend on water from the mountains, and that water is largely sourced as snowpack. So, um, accumulating through the winter, we tend to have deep seasonal snowpacks through a lot of the upper Rio Grande Basin and also in New Mexico in the higher peaks of the Sangre de Cristos and the other high mountains in that area locally. So the whole premise for being able to forecast is the fact that we do accumulate this snowpack high up in the mountain ahead of time, so we're able to assess exactly how much is up there, or at least an index of how much is up there. And then we know that is going to run off later in the springtime once the temperatures warm up, et cetera. So it's really based on that natural snowpack reservoir that can be measured in advance to give us an indication of what to expect later in the spring and summer runoff season.
One of the things that we've talked about a bunch on our show is how even a normal or above average snowpack doesn't necessarily translate to robust downstream flows. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. So, and this gets, you asked a little bit about the change too in the previous question. So there's no question that, the amount of snow we have in our mountains is changing and has changed, considerably in the last few decades. We can detect that just with our ground-based measurements. There's also a feedback between how much snow is in the mountains and what actually runs off. And it's not just simply, oh, there's less snow, so we have less water. There's other processes in play here related to forests, transpiration and evaporation and soil moisture conditions coming into a season that seem to be exacerbated recently with multiple years of dry conditions. So we have deficits entering the season that may be larger than what we're used to, even in the more recent historic record. So I will say, yeah, so if you think about less snow in the mountains, obviously that's going to mean less volume. It also can mean different timing of the runoff as well. And this is an issue because we have built our systems around an expectation of runoff at certain times of the year. So potentially, as we have warming and maybe more of the storms in the winter transition to more liquid precipitation rather than snow, we can actually have a similar amount of runoff, but coming at different times of the year. Now, that is not what we've been seeing in the most recent decade in the Rio Grande. In general, it's been just quite dry. So overall, the main force for runoff is going to be how much precipitation of any variety that we get throughout the year. And so as long as that remains low, we'll continue to have low runoff. I guess to talk more about the stream flow, and we have seen a significant reduction. Every 10 years, we update our stream flow normals. And basically that is a 30-year average and median that we calculate for the seasonal target periods that we forecast for. So again, that's typically either April, July, or March, July, or the standard target periods in the Rio Grande. And what we did see across the board in this recent update was less total volume of water running off during that time period. So our actual normals have lowered, which means that our interpretation of 100% of normal is actually less than it was for the previous 10 years.
So I'm interested in talking a little bit more about that. You've noted in your forecasts earlier in the year that people should understand that 100% of normal might not mean the same thing as it did last year. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it's basically, it feeds off of what I was just talking about, in the sense that if we have, let's say we have a watershed where the 30-year normal is 100,000 acre feet. And for the 1981 to 2010 period, which was our previous normal period, it might have been 120,000 acre feet. So there's been a 20,000 acre foot reduction, which is actually close to 20% reduction. And so it's important, if people are just looking at the percent of normal values, to realize that that is scaled to the new normal. So if what we used to consider normal was 120, we need to refocus and understand that 100% now actually means 100,000, not 120,000. So it's important to rescale.
Right. So I wanted to jump back a little bit to some of the factors that you talked about, like drier forests, for instance. I'm also thinking about soil moisture and relative humidity and these sorts of things. When we're looking at these sort of cumulative impacts to a watershed, like, how do we ever catch up? Do we ever catch up on some of these things, or how long does it take to catch up?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a decisive answer. It depends. It depends what happens in the future, always. And of course, we're not. One thing in water supply forecasting, I think sometimes people think we have a better view of what the actual future weather is going to be like, and that's not really the basis for our forecasts. Our forecasts right now are still really based on historical relationships between snowpack and runoff. And that's one of the concerns in the current environment. As the climate potentially changes, some of those relationships may not be as strong as they once were. So we still don't have a great alternate method. So we still proceed with that, using history to understand what's going to happen. And there still is a robust connection. It's not like we still measure snow in the mountains and we still see reasonable runoff based on those predictions. But I guess, could you ask the last part of your question? I was trying to remember what else you asked there.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking a question that's not fair to ask anybody, but I think so many of us want to know or understand, how many good years would we need to ever catch up?
Honestly, if things were wetter in the Rio Grande, it wouldn't necessarily take that long to catch up. I mean, the big question is that actually going to happen? And again, I do tend to look to history. I know we're in a time of greater uncertainty with what the climate will be doing, in the next decade or decades. However, we can look back, particularly at our stream flow records, which in the Rio Grande area honestly go back 100 years or more in some cases, and get an idea of what have things been like in the past. So as I mentioned, we update our normals every 30 years. I've actually gone back 80 years and looked at 30-year increments through time to see what those cycles have looked like. And the reality is the Rio Grande has always gone through, long cyclical periods of wetter and drier periods. So in a sense, what we're experiencing now is not unprecedented. Of course, the reasons we may be experiencing may be unprecedented. So of course, that's the concern right now.
Right. And of course, we have so much more demand than in the past.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, we talk on our show a lot about how sort of the climate change impacts over the past few decades, in particular since the 70s, when we've seen a couple degrees rise in temperature. We've certainly seen longer wildfire season, things like that. I'm curious, you've been doing forecasting in the Rio Grande Basin since 2009. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen, and maybe are you surprised by any of these changes or the pace of these changes?
Honestly, the Rio Grande, since I started forecasting in the late 2009, I think was when I first operationally began forecasting in the Rio Grande. It's really been consistently dry for the last 10 plus years. There's been an odd year here or there where we've gotten to median or above, but that's been the anomaly. There's also been a lot of impacts to the watersheds, particularly in Colorado, but other places too. And this has manifested in whether it be wildfire impacts or there's been a beetle kill situation as well. So we have places where the vegetation is being impacted on a broad scale. And we know conceptually that has an impact on the hydrology of those basins. Unfortunately, modeling that is difficult. And so we still are using, general relationships of snowpack to runoff. And it's hard to say exactly what those impacts are. We can look at a lot of research and understand that, when we remove canopy, there's actually multiple competing impacts and forces. Like we actually might get more snow accumulating in certain areas, but we also might melt that snow more rapidly in the springtime. So that gets back to it impacts on both volume and timing of the snowpack and runoff in the streams.
So I'm curious, your final thoughts. What is one thing that you would like everyone to kind of keep in mind this spring and looking forward?
So there's a lot of effort right now to improve our modeling. And so one of the things that I would mention as we transition to new technologies, whether that's remote sensing of snowpack or other hydrologic variables that we don't have great ground-based measurements of, is that it's going to take some time to integrate these new ideas and new modeling approaches into operational forecasting. I know everybody wants an immediate response to the issues, and it's certainly worth a lot of tension right now. But the fact is that some of these changes take time, and it also one thing I really want to mention here. We do have some emerging technologies that are very promising, and in the long run absolutely will improve our ability to forecast runoff. But in the meantime, we need to continue to support our legacy and ground-based systems, because there's a lot of information as we transition to new systems that's still going to be needed. And in fact, the ground-based measurements are still critical for the research and development of many of those new systems.
All right. Well, Angus Goodbody, thank you for helping keep us all informed. I look forward to your forecasts whenever they come out. Thanks for joining me today.
All right. Thank you. Take care.